Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to week 2 of our course Education 556. You have 2 chapters to read this week in the textbook. Chapter 2, which focuses on attendance, instruction, and assessment, and then Chapter 3, which focuses on school finance. Chapter 2 includes a lot about truancy and what is a truant and what are the consequences for kids becoming truants. I know that sounds like an old-fashioned term, and for many of you it may not apply, but if you work in a high school setting, the truancy laws come into play in surprising ways, and so I would urge you to pay some attention to that. For the day-to-day site administrator, perhaps the most important section in Chapter 2 is about safe schools and the law around safe schools. One of the things that surprises people is that public schools aren't just open to the public. You can't just walk in and roam around a school because that's been judged inappropriate and potentially unsafe for the children. And so as a school administrator, I had great power to keep my campus safe, to keep the knuckleheads off it, and that was important work for me, and it may indeed be important work for some of you. So there is a table which outlines a number of the laws that allow a principal to keep a school safe, and I'd urge you to take a look at that. The chapter veers into a discussion of assessment systems and talks about No Child Left Behind and talks about STAR. And that'll get some of you thinking, what's that doing there? Because No Child Left Behind is no longer the law of the land, and STAR is no longer our state assessment system. They've both been replaced. NCLB has been replaced by something called ESSA, the Every Student Succeeding Act, and STAR has been replaced by CASP, the California Assessment of Student Performance and Progress. Why doesn't our book know about it? Because our book was written before these things were being done. However, the authors were smart, and they have published an update to their textbook periodically. And so I downloaded that update this week, and I have placed it on Chapter 2. And what you'll like about the update is that it references specific pages in the book and then talks about things that have changed. So I would urge you to pay attention to the update. Chapter 3 goes into school finance. How do we pay for schools? You know, they're one of the most important things state and local government does, and they're very expensive to run. Well, the way we've paid for schools for forever has generally been through property taxes. Property taxes are stable from year to year, and we seem to have always been able to find enough revenue in most settings through property tax to pay for schools. However, property taxes are unequal. You know, property taxes raised in wealthy communities are much greater than property taxes raised in less wealthy communities. And this found its way into court in the 1970s. In California, you're going to learn about the case of Serrano versus Priest, which essentially outlawed property taxes by themselves as a way to pay for school districts, because in our state, the property taxes raised in Beverly Hills were so much more than the property taxes raised in Baldwin Park, which was the example in Serrano versus Priest. So we went through a long period of trying to equalize these things. Meanwhile, in federal court, the case of San Antonio versus Rodriguez in 1973 litigated essentially the same question, which is the fairness, the equity of some school districts being able to raise more money than others for funding their schools. A famous difference, though, is that San Antonio, which was a federal case, did not reach the same finding as Serrano. Essentially, the federal court did not determine that education was a fundamental right under the Constitution. And so they left it to states to figure out how to fund schools and how to deal with equity. Meanwhile, in California, we were still trying to even things out, and in 1976, we had a second iteration of the Serrano case, which was essentially an argument about how are we going to equalize funding in school districts so that we get to some sense of fairness. And then it got all blown up again in 1978 when the voters in our state passed Proposition 13. Proposition 13 passed when I was a freshman in college, and it cut everyone's property taxes dramatically And it also dramatically reduced the rate at which property taxes could rise, and led to substantial changes in school funding. There was less money, so that meant that instead of local taxes, which property taxes were, paying for schools, that we had to use state income taxes and sales taxes and other funds to cover schools as well in order to equalize it. There's a great example of the unfairness of property taxes in our book on page 110, which gets to Warren Buffett, probably one of the wealthiest men in our country, who talks about a home he owned in Laguna Beach as an example of the unfairness of property tax. He had bought it in the early 70s for $100,000, but his taxes were too low. His house was worth millions, but he was still being taxed as though it was worth far less than that. And what's funny about that to me is that that house of Warren Buffett's was actually on my paper route when I was a little boy. I lived not that many houses away from Mr. Buffett, although not nearly so well. So that's what you have to look forward to in your reading this week. Finally, your paper, your opinion piece, is due at the end of the week. I've posted an example of an opinion piece. We talked about it on our online session. But if you encounter questions as you work on the piece, please feel free to get in touch with me about them. Well, this has been a long introduction to the week. I hope it helps you, and I hope you have a good week. Take care now. Bye-bye.